They said the old man had nothing left to teach until the wildest horse on the ranch bowed his head and followed him without a rope. The wind that swept across Black River Ranch wasn't the kind that whispered it, carried the weight of stories, unspoken regrets, and half-buried truths. Late summer had browned the fields into a brittle patchwork of golden grass, and the horizon shimmered with dust. As the sun hovered over the rim of the plains like a watchful sentinel, an old truck rolled slowly up the gravel path, its engine more a rasp than a roar. From it stepped a man whose presence turned eyes not because of grandeur, but because of the stillness he carried. Elijah Cole. He wasn't tall or imposing, but something about him made people pause. Maybe it was the way he moved unhurried, as though time had learned to wait for him. Or maybe it was the faded felt hat, worn boots, and the leather satchel that looked older than most of the men working the ranch. Elijah didn't carry much, but what he brought with him was heavier than luggage. It was memory. A few ranch hands noticed him immediately. They paused mid-task, squinting against the glare, and exchanged looks that weren't so much hostile as amused. One of them, a lanky young man with too much confidence and too little experience, tilted his head toward the approaching figure. "You think that's the guy Carter was talking about?" he asked. "Looks like he wandered out of a Western novel." His buddy shrugged. "If that's Elijah Cole, he's 50 years late." But Elijah didn't hear them, or if he did, he gave no indication. He walked with a subtle limp, his left leg dragging, just slightly the result of a rodeo injury, decades old. Time had weathered his face but hadn't hardened it. Instead, his features carried a softness lines carved not just by age but by listening, by waiting. He made his way to the barn where Wesley Carter stood leaning against a post, arms crossed, phone in hand. Wesley was young in his early 30s with ambition coiled tight beneath the surface. He had inherited Black River Ranch when his father passed and had turned it into something leaner, sharper, more efficient, but also colder. Tradition had no place in his version of the future. When Elijah approached, Wesley barely looked up. He kept his phone in hand, scrolling absently. "You're early," he muttered. "Sun's been up for hours," Elijah replied calmly. "Thought I'd see the place before the heat hit." Wesley finally met his gaze, clearly sizing him up. "Look, I'm not paying for a storybook reunion. We've got a problem. His name's Titan. Thoroughbred. Should have been a champion, but after the injury he turned feral. Can't get a saddle on him. Won't let anyone close. The last guy he threw had to get 8 stitches and a new jaw." Elijah didn't flinch. "You want him sold, no one's buying him. Not anymore. Tried every trainer this side of the state line. Thought maybe you had one more miracle in you, or maybe you just needed a place to die slow." It wasn't said with venom, but with the casual dismissal of someone who thought he understood power. Elijah only nodded. "I'm not here for miracles. Just the horse." Wesley gestured with his chin toward the far paddock. "Be my guest, but don't say I didn't warn you." Elijah made his way through the yard, past the murmuring hands and curious glances. The paddock where Titan lived was more fortress than fence, a reinforced enclosure that suggested more prison than pasture. And inside it, pacing like a creature, trapped between memory and fury, was the horse. Titan was magnificent. Even from a distance, Elijah could see it, the raw, unfinished poetry in the way his muscles moved beneath that coal-black coat, the restless toss of his head, the scars barely visible beneath his mane. This was not a broken horse. This was one who refused to be broken. And Elijah understood that look in his eyes because he had worn it once too. He didn't approach the gate. Not yet. He stopped several feet away, removed his hat, and stood in the heat, simply watching. Titan noticed. His ears flicked. His nostrils flared. He snorted once and stomped the earth as if issuing a challenge. Elijah didn't respond. He just breathed in the air and listened not to the sounds around him, but to the rhythm of stillness, the language between beings who had both been betrayed by time and expectation. For the rest of the morning, Elijah sat near the paddock, legs crossed, leaning back against a fence post. He didn't speak, didn't whistle, didn't try to bribe the stallion with treats. He simply stayed, and Titan, though at first restless, began to slow. The pacing turned into a wide arc, the snorts into silence. Not trust, not yet, but curiosity. By the third day, the ranch hands had stopped mocking and started whispering. They didn't understand what they were seeing, but they couldn't stop watching. Wesley scoffed when he saw Elijah sitting in the same spot again. "You do realize this isn't therapy," he called out. If he wanted a therapist, he'd be lying on a couch, not chewing the gate. Elijah smiled faintly, eyes never leaving Titan. "Sometimes it's not the horse that needs therapy. It's the people who've been trying to ride him." That night, Titan didn't retreat to the far corner when Elijah approached. He stood his ground. Their eyes met for longer than a moment. There was no lightning bolt of recognition, no dramatic transformation. Just the beginning of something old and patient, a willingness to remain near. On the fifth day, Elijah finally stepped inside the paddock. He didn't rush. Each step was deliberate, not cautious but respectful. He kept his posture relaxed, body open, hands visible. Titan didn't charge, but his muscles twitched with readiness. He had thrown men before. He knew what came next, but this was different. There was no rope, no bridle, no pressure. Elijah stopped a good 10 feet away, then slowly sat on the ground. The earth was hot, the sun relentless. He didn't move. He didn't blink. Titan watched him. Minutes passed, then an hour. By midday, Titan took a step forward. It was just one step, but it mattered. Elijah stood slowly, never turning his back, never making himself small, and walked to the gate. He left without touching the horse, without making a sound. The moment wasn't about accomplishment, it was about permission. The sixth day brought a strange quiet over the ranch, the kind that settles before something important. The hands went about their work, but their eyes drifted toward the paddock. Wesley stood in the shade, pretending to scroll through his phone, but watching just the same. Elijah entered the corral again. This time, Titan didn't flinch. He stood tall, proud, as if ready to see what the man wanted. Elijah didn't want anything. That was the secret. He wasn't there to take. He was there to offer, to give space, give time, give attention. He whispered something under his breath, the words only the wind could catch. That evening, a ranch hand said quietly, "It's like they're having a conversation." Another nodded. "I don't think he's trying to ride the horse." "Then what's he doing?" "He's waiting for the horse to invite him." It was the first time in months that Titan lay down to rest in the open, and he did so near the place where Elijah had been sitting. Not beside him, but not far. Close enough that if someone had squinted from a distance, they might have mistaken them for silhouettes cast by the same sun. By the end of that week, there was no doubt in anyone's mind something was happening. Not a miracle, not magic, but a returning. Titan wasn't being tamed. He was being remembered. Each morning came with the same golden light spilling over the eastern ridge of Black River Ranch, but something about the air felt different now. It was quieter, heavier with anticipation, as though the land itself sensed that something was shifting between the old man and the black stallion who once ruled the paddock like a storm waiting to break. Elijah Cole didn't need to announce anything. He showed up each day with the same rhythm, the same calm, the same understated grace that had begun to feel like part of the landscape. By now, the ranch hands no longer laughed when they saw him. They didn't quite understand what they were witnessing, but they had seen just enough to know it wasn't a trick. Some mornings they would pause from their chores just to lean against the rails and watch. They didn't speak. They didn't interfere. They just observed the strange and sacred dance unfolding between man and horse. Elijah never entered the paddock with an agenda. He never came with expectations or timelines. His only plan was to listen, to offer space and presence, not pressure. He understood something most others had forgotten or never known, that the taming of a wild thing had more to do with earning than imposing, more to do with offering than demanding. And with Titan, every offering mattered. The stallion had begun to respond, not in obvious ways, but in those subtle shifts that only someone who had truly spent time around horses could recognize. When Elijah arrived, Titan would lift his head. When Elijah moved, Titan's ears would follow. It wasn't obedience. It was attention. And attention, Elijah knew, was the seed of trust. One morning, Elijah brought nothing with him, not even a rope. He wore his old vest, soft and sun-worn, and carried a small harmonica in his back pocket. He didn't play it yet. Instead, he stood just inside the fence line where Titan had grown used to his presence. He kept his body open, his energy low. He didn't move quickly or with assertion. He simply allowed Titan to feel him, to study him, to sense every unspoken message his posture sent. Then gently, Elijah began to walk not toward Titan, but parallel to him, moving along the edge of the paddock in a wide arc. He made no attempt to engage directly. He just walked his boots sinking into the dry soil, his footsteps soft. Titan watched unmoving, at first his gaze sharp, uncertain. But as Elijah continued, the stallion began to step. Slowly, cautiously. He mirrored the man's pace from a distance. This was the beginning of something new. Over the following days, this practice became a ritual, a silent walk, a circle of mutual awareness. Elijah called it the shadow walk, though he never spoke the term aloud. It was a way of inviting Titan into a relationship of rhythm and respect. He walked, the horse followed, at first from 30 feet away, then 20, then 10. It was not a chase, it was a choice. Titan chose to come closer. Eventually, Elijah introduced the harmonica. He didn't play a tune, not at first. He just let the breath pass through it, soft notes that floated into the morning air, like questions waiting to be answered. Music was never about control for him. It was about presence. The vibrations, the softness, the warmth of it. He knew that sometimes a horse could hear with more than just ears. Titan responded to the music in his own way. His head would tilt, his steps would slow, and sometimes, if the tune was particularly sweet, he would close his eyes for a moment and breathe deeper. Elijah noted every detail but never forced the interaction further. He wanted Titan to decide what came next. By the end of the second week, Elijah dared to close the distance. One step at a time, he shortened the invisible gap between them. He walked his wide circle smaller. Titan didn't back away. When Elijah stopped, Titan would stop. When Elijah turned, Titan would pause and follow again. It was the kind of exchange that couldn't be taught in manuals or reinforced with tools. It was old wordless wisdom that passed between hearts rather than mouths. One crisp morning, the sky still colored with the blush of dawn, Elijah stood just 5 feet away from Titan. He didn't move, didn't raise a hand. He waited. Titan, after a long, breathless silence, took a step forward, then another, until finally his wide forehead rested lightly against Elijah's chest. The ranch hands watching from the gate didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They stood still, reverent, as though they had accidentally stumbled into a moment that didn't belong to them. Even Wesley Carter, observing from the porch of the main house, stopped mid-sip of his coffee and stared. It wasn't possible, he thought, and yet it was happening. Elijah placed one hand gently on Titan's neck. The stallion didn't pull away. His muscles tensed, then softened beneath the old man's touch. They stood there like that for nearly a minute, just breathing together, no sound but the wind and the low rustle of leaves in the cottonwoods beyond the pasture. The connection was real, fragile, and miraculous. That day, Elijah introduced something new. Not a bridle, not a saddle, just a soft lead rope, loosely looped and held with the gentlest grip. He didn't use it to control. He used it to communicate. A suggestion, not a command. And to everyone's astonishment, Titan didn't rebel. He walked with Elijah around the enclosure, calm and collected as if he had been doing so his whole life. In the days that followed, their rhythm deepened. Elijah began to hum as he worked around Titan, brushing his coat, cleaning his hooves, touching the places others hadn't dared approach. Titan responded with the grace of a creature who had remembered something long buried within himself, the desire not just to run, but to relate. And then came the moment that no one could have expected. Elijah was sitting on a low bench just inside the paddock, wiping dust from his hat when Titan approached him on his own. The stallion lowered his massive head, nudged the brim of Elijah's hat, and then slowly and deliberately lowered himself to the ground beside him. Horses don't lie down easily, not in open spaces, not around people. It's a gesture of extraordinary trust, a signal that says, I'm not afraid. I am safe here. Elijah didn't move. He just watched, eyes glistening, heart full. And in that moment, he knew that something sacred had been born. Not obedience, not victory, but partnership. That night, the ranch was unusually still. The hands sat around the fire quieter than usual, the heat of the flames flickering across their thoughtful faces. Someone broke the silence, asking, "You ever seen anything like that?" No one answered for a long while. Finally, an older wrangler cleared his throat and said, "I've seen horses run fast. I've seen them jump fences and tear through fields like lightning. But I ain't never seen one sit down beside a man like he was family." Another nodded slowly. "That horse ain't just tamed, he's changed." Wesley heard their words from the porch and walked away without saying a thing. He couldn't admit it, but he was starting to wonder. Was there something about the way Elijah worked, the quiet persistence, the refusal to demand that revealed more than just how to handle a horse? Maybe Wesley thought this wasn't about Titan at all. Maybe it never had been. By the time the sun rose on the 21st day, the land at Black River Ranch seemed to exhale with a strange kind of expectation. The air held that tension, the kind that settles before a thunderstorm or a reckoning. Word had quietly spread first among the ranch hands, then to nearby properties. Something was coming. Something that hadn't happened in years, maybe decades. Titan, the horse that had defied every handler, might be ridden again, and not by just anyone, but by an old trainer with a quiet voice and slower steps than most. Elijah Cole had not promised anything, but people were coming anyway. Not to see a spectacle, but because they were beginning to believe in something that had once felt impossible. Wesley Carter watched the stirrings of anticipation with a clenched jaw. He'd allowed this long enough. For days he had waited, watching Elijah do what seemed to him like nothing. No commands, no discipline, no guarantees. Yet somehow the impossible had begun to tilt toward the real, and it threatened everything Wesley thought he understood about control, power, and authority. That morning, Wesley approached Elijah just after sunrise as the older man was walking the perimeter of Titan's paddock, moving with that same practiced stillness that had defined him from the beginning. Wesley didn't waste time with small talk. "You've had your 3 weeks," he said curtly. "People are starting to talk. If you've got something to show, show it." "Today," Elijah paused, not out of surprise but reflection. He didn't look at Wesley directly. Instead, he glanced toward the paddock where Titan was already watching from a distance. The stallion's breath was visible in the cool morning air, his posture calm but alert. "I never asked for an audience," Elijah said quietly. "But you've got one," Wesley replied. "So let's not disappoint them." Elijah nodded once, as if to himself. "Then I suppose today will be the day." By mid-morning, the corral was surrounded. The usual work at the ranch slowed, then stopped. Even the older wranglers who had once dismissed Elijah as a romantic relic stood alongside the fence, with arms crossed and eyes narrowed. They knew horses. They'd seen good ones, bad ones, and beasts that no one could touch. But something about this had pulled them in, not out of skepticism, but hope. Titan stood in the center of the corral, his body gleaming in the sun. The black sheen of his coat rippled as he shifted his weight, not with restlessness, but power held in restraint. He was not a broken animal. He was something else entirely, still wild but willing. Elijah entered the corral without tools or tension. He wore the same vest and wide-brimmed hat, his walk unhurried, his breath even. He carried only a soft rope looped loosely in his hand. Titan didn't flinch. He stepped toward Elijah with something close to anticipation, the kind of motion a soldier might make when he sees his commander, a shared language, a silent understanding. The silence around the corral deepened as Elijah placed one hand on Titan's neck. Then, after a long moment of stillness, he swung one leg over and mounted the stallion's bare back. There was no bridle, no bit, no saddle, just balance and breath and trust. Titan stood completely still, waiting. Elijah sat upright, eyes ahead, his hands resting gently on his thighs. He didn't squeeze. He didn't prompt. He simply shifted his weight forward ever so slightly, and Titan moved. It wasn't the stiff, hesitant movement of a horse obeying under duress. It was fluid, measured, elegant. One step became two. A walk became a slow, rhythmic trot. Elijah adjusted his posture with ease, not steering Titan, but aligning with him, matching movement for movement like a current meeting the shore. Around the corral, men exchanged glances. This wasn't supposed to be happening. They had seen this horse throw champions crush reputations, and now here he was, moving beneath a man as though they'd been riding together for years. Wesley's voice cut through the air, sharp and suspicious. "That's not proof of anything. Let's see what he does when you ask him to run." Elijah didn't look up. He didn't answer. He just leaned forward, his knees giving the subtlest cue, and whispered something only Titan could hear. In an instant, the black stallion surged forward, not with chaos or fury, but with unleashed grace. His hooves thundered against the earth, sending dust spiraling into golden clouds. His stride was long, controlled, breathtaking. It was the run of a creature who had not been forced but invited, not commanded but inspired. The sound of Titan's gallop echoed across the open land like a song no one had heard in years. Elijah remained balanced and fluid on his back, his body moving in perfect harmony with the stallion's gait. It was not domination. It was a kind of communion. Every eye was locked on the pair, the old man and the impossible horse flying together, rewriting every assumption that had been made in the months before. The disbelief was palpable. Some of the ranch hands leaned forward unconsciously as if needing to get closer to confirm with their own senses that what they were seeing was real. When Titan finally slowed, it wasn't because he was asked, it was because he chose to. He returned to the center of the corral and came to a stop with Elijah still balanced effortlessly on his back. There was no lather of sweat, no wildness in his eyes, only strength, only peace. Elijah slid down from the horse and stood at his side. Titan remained still, head slightly bowed, breath steady. Elijah reached up and ran a hand down the stallion's neck. He wasn't waiting for someone to control him, Elijah said softly, though everyone heard. He was waiting for someone who would listen. No one spoke. No one moved. Wesley stood frozen, arms still crossed, but his fingers now gripped his sleeves tightly, knuckles pale. He had expected a demonstration of failure. Instead, he'd been given a revelation. His certainty, built on the foundations of order and control, had begun to crumble. Someone at the far end of the fence exhaled as though they'd been holding their breath for the past 10 minutes. Another tipped his hat silently. Elijah led Titan toward the gate, not by pulling but by walking. The stallion followed with no hesitation. Just outside the corral, the pair paused. Elijah turned back toward the group of men gathered. "I didn't come here to perform," he said. "I came because this horse still had something to say. He just needed someone who spoke the same language." And with that, he and Titan walked away, not dramatically, not defiantly, but with quiet dignity, like two souls who had finally found each other after a long, lonely journey. The crowd didn't cheer. They couldn't. Not because they didn't want to, but because awe had replaced applause. What they had witnessed was more than skill. It was more than training. It was the rare and sacred result of patience, empathy, and earned trust. At the edge of the paddock, Elijah paused for a moment and let Titan look out toward the open fields. The stallion's ears flicked forward. His body stood taller. He was ready, not because someone had forced him, but because someone had finally believed in him. The dust from Titan's hooves had barely begun to settle, but the silence it left behind seemed permanent. No one at Black River Ranch moved, not the seasoned wranglers who had once ridden with pride and grit, not the younger ranch hands who had laughed behind Elijah Cole's back in the early days, and certainly not Wesley Carter, whose grip on the rail had tightened until his knuckles turned white. They had all witnessed something they couldn't fully explain, a moment that didn't scream for applause, but instead demanded reverence. The impossible had been undone without a single shout, a whip, or a show of strength. It had unraveled gently like dawn breaking over stubborn darkness. Titan stood beside Elijah, calm and grounded, not tamed in the conventional sense, but finally known, finally seen. There was a peace about the black stallion that hadn't been there before, depth that couldn't be trained or coerced. It had to be earned, and it had. Elijah gave him a soft pat on the neck and whispered something no one else could hear. Then he turned and walked toward the open gate. Titan followed without hesitation. The image was almost too much an old man with a slight limp leading the very horse that had broken the best. They didn't look like conqueror and conquered. They looked like companions. Behind them, the ranch hands began to shift. Some removed their hats. Others exchanged glances, not of confusion, but of realization. Miguel, one of the younger men who had once cracked jokes about Elijah's age, was the first to speak. "He didn't ride him," he said quietly. "Not like we do. That wasn't a ride. That was something else." Someone beside him added, "He never broke that horse. He built something with him." And that was the truth, though few could have named it outright. What had unfolded in that corral was not about dominance or performance. It was about understanding. Elijah hadn't come to prove himself. He had come to give Titan what no one else had thought he deserved: a voice. Wesley stood apart from the others, his face unreadable. He hadn't said a word since the demonstration. He hadn't needed to. His silence betrayed the storm within. The control he had spent months tightening around the ranch, around his employees, around that horse, had been undone not by rebellion, but by relationship. Later that afternoon, Elijah was seen out near the pasture. He wasn't working. He wasn't training. He was simply sitting beneath the shade of an old cottonwood, his hat pulled low, the harmonica resting quietly on his lap. Titan grazed nearby, not tethered, not penned, but free to wander. And yet he stayed close. A few of the hands approached. They didn't come with questions, not at first. They came with silence. They sat near Elijah, mirroring his posture, unsure what to say or how to ask for what they wanted. Eventually, one of them, an older hand named Royce, broke the quiet. "I've been around horses for 30 years, he said. Thought I'd seen just about everything a man can see on a ranch." Elijah looked up patient. "But I've never seen a horse change a man," Royce continued, "let alone a whole group of us." Elijah gave a soft chuckle, more breath than sound. "That horse didn't change anyone," he said. "He just reminded us of something we'd forgotten." "What's that?" Miguel asked genuinely. "That respect isn't taught by shouting and trust doesn't grow in the shadow of fear." It wasn't meant as a lesson. It wasn't said with pride. It was simply what Elijah believed, and now, after 3 weeks at Black River Ranch, others were beginning to believe it too. Later that week, something appeared in the barn. No one took credit for it, but all suspected who was behind it. Mounted on the wall above the saddles was a wooden plaque carved by hand. It read, "He didn't break the wild. He reminded it how to breathe." The words weren't fancy. They weren't gilded or framed. But everyone who walked past them paused for a moment longer than necessary. Not because of what they said about Elijah, but because of what they implied about themselves. Wesley avoided the barn for a few days. He kept to the office, answering emails, making calls, pretending that the heartbeat of the ranch hadn't shifted in his absence. But he knew. He could feel it. The men who once waited for his direction now looked to each other. Decisions were made with quieter voices, but greater confidence. There was less force in the work, more rhythm. And somehow things were getting done better than before. On the 4th evening after the ride, Wesley finally made his way to the barn. It was empty save for Elijah, who was brushing Titan down slow and careful, as though the horse were an old friend instead of a former enemy. "You've got everyone in this place looking at you like you're some kind of prophet," Wesley said from the doorway. Elijah didn't turn. He finished brushing before he responded. "They're not looking at me," he said. "They're looking at what's possible." Wesley stepped closer. "You made me look like a fool." Elijah finally looked up, eyes steady. "I never said a word against you." "That's the worst part," Wesley admitted. "You didn't have to." There was no anger in his voice, only weariness. And beneath it, perhaps something more fragile doubt. Elijah studied him for a moment. "You didn't build this place to control everything, Wesley. You built it because you believed in what could grow here." "I'm not so sure anymore. That's why you're feeling lost. Not because you've lost control, but because you forgot what you were trying to build in the first place." They stood in silence for a while. Then before leaving, Wesley said quietly, "I don't know what you said to that horse." Elijah smiled just faintly. "I told him I wouldn't ask for anything he wasn't ready to give." Wesley didn't answer, but as he walked away, he paused by the plaque. He read the words again, this time slower, as though searching for something in them. Then he tipped his hat perhaps to the sentiment, perhaps to the man who now embodied it, and stepped outside. In the following weeks, the ranch changed not because of orders or revolutions, but because the people within it had been moved by something real. The old ways didn't vanish, but they were softened. The younger hands began to ask more questions. The older ones began to listen more. And Titan, the horse once labeled untamable, became not only a partner in the work, but a symbol, a reminder that respect, when given freely, had the power to transform. Elijah stayed longer than he'd planned, not because he was needed, but because he was wanted. People began to bring him their most difficult horses, not to fix them, but to understand them. And he never promised results. He only promised patience. One morning just before dawn, Elijah sat in the pasture beside Titan. The world was still dark, but the horizon held the faintest promise of light. He closed his eyes and let the silence wash over him. This, he thought, was enough. Not the recognition, not the miracle, but the quiet proof that gentleness could echo louder than force. And somewhere out in the barn, the dust began to settle again, not because something had ended, but because something deeper had taken root. A truth that wouldn't be spoken in meetings or memos, but would live in every hand that touched a horse, every footstep across the dry ground, every silent choice to listen before leading. At Black River Ranch, a legacy had been rewritten, not in the ink of records or the lines of contracts, but in the bond between a man and a horse, and the courage it took to believe in something better. At the heart of Black River Ranch, among the dust-swept fields and the whispering winds, unfolded a story that defied every expectation. What began as mockery toward an aging horse trainer turned into a quiet revolution, one that unfolded not with fanfare, but with presence, patience, and purpose. Elijah Cole did not arrive at the ranch to reclaim lost glory, nor did he seek to prove a point. He came simply and profoundly to listen to a horse that had been written off, to a ranch that had forgotten its roots, and to a truth that had long been silenced beneath layers of noise and control. From the moment Elijah stepped out of that old pickup truck, he was underestimated. By Wesley Carter, the sharp-minded owner who measured value and efficiency, by the ranch hands who mocked the idea that anything could come from an old man with a soft voice, and perhaps even by Titan himself, the proud and powerful stallion who had learned to resist every touch and reject every attempt to break his spirit. But Elijah never responded with resistance of his own. He brought nothing to prove, only time to offer. Over the course of days, then weeks, something subtle began to shift. It wasn't a change imposed, it was one invited. Elijah didn't force Titan to follow commands. He invited him into conversation. Through gentle walks, silent moments, and an understanding deeper than words, he built a bond with the horse that everyone else had abandoned. And Titan, in turn, responded, not because he had been broken, but because he had been heard. The transformation wasn't theatrical, it was quiet, it was gradual, and it was unshakable. When the time came for Elijah to ride Titan, the ranch was ready to witness either a miracle or a failure. What they saw was something greater than either. They saw harmony. They saw movement without struggle, guidance without force. They saw a stallion run, not from fear but from joy, a creature whose legs stretched across the earth like he was chasing his own freedom, and found someone willing to run beside him, not on top of him. The image of Elijah and Titan, one man, one horse, moving together with complete trust and grace, changed the air of that place forever. Men who had spent their lives believing in the whip, the rope, the loudest voice, now stood in silence, unable to deny what they had witnessed. Their understanding of power shifted. Their idea of respect was rewritten. And then came the real transformation, not in the horse or even in Elijah, but in the people who had watched. Wesley Carter, once so rigid in his ways, so insistent on results and authority, was left speechless, not because he had been defeated, but because he had been reminded. Reminded of what drew him to the land in the first place. Reminded that control without connection is hollow. That efficiency without empathy leaves something vital behind. The hands who had once rolled their eyes now sought Elijah's guidance, not just for training horses, but for learning how to lead with stillness, how to listen, how to build something stronger than submission, mutual trust. By the end of it all, Elijah didn't stand on a pedestal. He didn't claim victory. He didn't give speeches. He kept brushing Titan down after each ride the same as before. Because to him, this was never about spectacle. It was about stewardship. It was about remembering that even the wildest creature, when treated with honor, will show a kind of strength that force can never summon. The wooden plaque that appeared in the barn summed it up best. He didn't break the wild. He reminded it how to breathe. Those words were never meant to glorify Elijah. They were a mirror held up to everyone who saw the journey unfold. A reminder that what we often try to overpower in others may simply be waiting for a gentler approach. The trust isn't earned in a moment. It's built in stillness. It's won in how we show up when no one is watching, in how we listen when there's nothing being said. The deeper lesson from Elijah's story is this: in a world that often values dominance, speed, and control, the most enduring impact comes from presence, patience, and care. Whether we're dealing with animals, people, children, partners, or even ourselves, the way to healing, to growth, and to cooperation lies not in forcing change, but in fostering trust. We live in a time when the loudest voices often drown out the most meaningful ones, when quick fixes are sold as solutions, and when being soft is mistaken for weakness. But Elijah's story reminds us that true strength is quiet, it's consistent, and it transforms not through coercion, but through connection. So how can we apply this to our own lives? Maybe it starts with listening more and speaking less. Maybe it means approaching those we don't understand with curiosity instead of judgment. Maybe it means being willing to wait for others, for ourselves, for the right time, without trying to force things into our own impatient timelines. Whether you're leading a team, raising a child, repairing a relationship, or trying to rebuild something inside of yourself, you can be the Elijah in your own story. You can be the quiet presence that changes everything, not by shouting, but by showing up with grace. This story may have taken place on a ranch with a horse and an old trainer, but its truth belongs everywhere in classrooms, homes, boardrooms, and hearts. Because no matter who you are or what you face, the way forward doesn't have to be about overpowering. It can be about understanding. It can be about trust. And if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of something true and worth holding on to, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel and help us keep telling the kinds of stories that matter. Stories that speak to the soul. Stories that remind us of what we've forgotten in a world moving too fast. Your support helps us bring more light, more honesty, and more meaning into the world, one quiet moment at a time. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, keep listening, keep trusting, keep breathing.